Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode number 37. So, today we're talking about one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the US, D.B. Cooper. So, Tom, what do you know about this story?
This is probably going to be really off, but I know it involved an actor and a plane.
Okay, you got half of it right.
Okay.
So he wasn't an actor, but it, yes, very much involved a plane. So going into this research for this episode, I didn't really know much about it either. I actually thought that they kind of like knew who this guy was, but it turns out they don't. And there's a lot of questions and mystery around it. And I don't know about you, but like usually unsolved mysteries drive me crazy. Although I did watch the show as a kid and Robert Stack's voice used to creep the fuck out of me, but that's a whole nother discussion.
He had a creepy voice.
He did. He did. And as a kid, like it was a little much.
That's what made Airplane so funny, is that it was a bunch of the original Airplane was so funny because it was a bunch of like him and Leslie Nielsen and Robert Hayes were all dramatic actors playing comedic roles. And that's what made it really funny.
So I don't usually love unsolved mysteries. Like I like closure to it. But this one is interesting. I'm definitely interested to hear your thoughts and what you think happened in this case. We're going to get into the story of what happened, discuss the evidence and the aftermath, and take a look at a few potential suspects. So, are you ready to get into it?
Let's do it.
Our story begins in early 1970s America, where people were outraged over the ongoing Vietnam War. There were countless protests and this emergence of a very anti authority sentiment around the country. People began to revere so called rebels, and they really wanted to root for them. Well, they got one to root for in late 1971. On November 24th of that year, the day before Thanksgiving, a man walked into the Portland airport and approached the ticket counter for the Northwest Orient Airlines. He purchased a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle for $20 under the name Dan Cooper. The man was later described as unremarkable, a typical businessman. He looked to be in his mid 40s and was dressed in a black suit with a white shirt and a black tie, as well as a black overcoat and black loafers. He was one of the last passengers to board the Boeing 727 plane, flight number 305, and made his way to the back of the plane to take his seat, 18C. While awaiting takeoff, he ordered a bourbon and soda and smoked his Raleigh filter tip cigarettes. Around this point, he also donned a pair of black sunglasses with mirrored lenses.
I'm sorry I have to stop you. Back in the days when you could smoke and drink on airplanes, like that airplane had to feel like a friggin' ashtray. Like I can't even think of being able to smoke on an airplane now.
The flight took off right on time at 2:50 p.m. with 36 passengers and 6 crew members in total. That really blew me away. 36 passengers. And I'm going to tell you, the jealousy that I have for these people and their ample leg room is just unfair.
Yeah, but see, the flip side of that is I've been on some of those like commuter planes that make those short flights. I was on a flight from Pittsburgh to Cleveland once that was literally just it didn't even have an interior. It was just the shell of the plane with seats inside.
No, thank you.
No.
That's a hard no from me. The flight duration was to be about an hour. Shortly after takeoff, around 3 p.m., Cooper handed one of the stewardesses, Florence Schaffner, a note. She tucked it in her pocket, thinking that he was a lonely businessman giving her his number. He then whispered to her, quote, "Miss, you better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence then opened the note, which was written in felt tip pen, and said, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase, and I want you to sit by me."
Better read that note that says I have a bomb. Cuts to note saying I have a bomb.
Right? It sounds a little cartoonish, doesn't it?
This is not a man, but three children stacked together in a trench coat. Why do you need to read the note? You've already said what the note says. You've defeated the purpose of the note.
Well, he needed to further his point of like her sitting next to him. But yeah, kind of gave away the farm there, didn't he? Florence complied, and Cooper opened his briefcase, which contained 2 rows of 4 red cylinders that looked like dynamite, a battery, and a bunch of wires. He instructed her to write down what he was about to tell her. She took the note that Cooper dictated to the cockpit to inform the pilot, Captain William Scott. Cooper was demanding 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. So this is about the equivalent of $1.5 million today. Captain Scott instructed Florence to stay in the cockpit and take detailed notes of the events as they were happening, which I thought was genius, that was one of his first thoughts, you know? Captain Scott radioed Northwest Flight Operations with the demands, quote, Cooper requests $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 p.m. He wants 2 front parachutes and 2 back parachutes, and he wants the money in American currency. He then advised the Seattle-Tacoma Airport Traffic Control of the situation, who in turn contacted the local police and FBI. Because the flight was so short, authorities needed time to get the money and the parachutes together. The plane circled above Puget Sound for about 2 hours, and passengers were told that they would be delayed due to a minor mechanical difficulty. They had no idea what was really happening. The president of Northwest authorized payment of the ransom and ordered all employees to cooperate with Cooper and comply with his demands. The ransom money was received from Seattle First National Bank and was, as requested, 10,000 $20 bills. The serial numbers were documented by the FBI, and the haul weighed about 19 pounds. Now, there was some later discussion about why he didn't ask for $100 bills, as that would have weighed about 5 pounds. And my only guess in this situation is that hundreds weren't used as frequently in 1971, and he didn't want to raise any suspicion by using large bills. Like, that's my take on it. And he kind of was like, okay, do I want a little extra weight or do I want to raise suspicion with large bills? So I think that was the calculation.
Yeah. I think he figured that the 20s were going to be easier to kind of pass or launder or whatever.
While waiting to land, another flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, sat next to Cooper to act as a liaison between him and the crew in the cockpit. He communicated further demands. He wanted a fuel truck brought in to refuel the plane when they landed. All passengers were to remain on board until he had the money, and the parachutes were to be brought on last. Mucklow and Cooper made small talk while they waited, and he asked where she was from. She asked him the same, though he didn't answer, but as he looked out the window, it was clear that he was familiar with the Tacoma area and nearby McCord Air Force Base. Mucklow later said that Cooper was not nervous. He was nice and not cruel or nasty. He spoke in a low tone, but quite intelligently. As he offered her a cigarette, she asked why he chose this airline and this flight. He replied, quote, "Not because I have a grudge against your airline, it's just because I have a grudge." He also allegedly spoke briefly to an unidentified passenger while they were circling, but it's unknown what was said between the two of them. The flight finally landed in Seattle at 5:46 p.m. Cooper wanted only one airline representative to approach the plane, and there was to be only one exit and entrance point, which I thought was smart. He's really controlling the situation, you know?
That's how you're going to do it. If you're going to do something like this, I guess that's how you do it. I don't have a grudge against your airline. I just have a grudge.
The fact that he was so non-specific about it, like, I wish they had more of a motive, because you don't get more of one than that. You just don't. So it's like, I want to know what your grudge was. Why are you mad?
He was probably mad because like traffic was bad one day.
Mucklow went outside to retrieve the money and brought it back to Cooper, who was still sitting in the back of the plane. All 36 passengers were released unharmed as Cooper inspected the money. Mucklow jokingly asked if she could have some of the money, and without hesitation, He handed her a handful of bills. She had to decline due to airline policy, as did two other crew members. I don't know. I don't think airline policy would be the first thing in my mind right then, but
See, but at the same time, didn't they just give the order to comply with his every demand?
excellent point. Yes. Mucklow then made 3 more trips off the plane to get the parachutes. As she brought them on, she attempted to hand Cooper directions on how to use them, but he said he didn't need them. While he was waiting, Cooper agreed to let 2 of the crew members go. As the plane was getting refueled, there was a problem with the first fuel truck, causing a delay. A second and third truck had to be sent out to complete the refuel. Cooper was getting a bit antsy and was complaining that the bag with the ransom money was cloth, not a knapsack, as he had requested. He proceeded to cut the canopy from one of the parachutes and stuffed the money in there. An FAA official then requested a face to face meeting with Cooper aboard the plane, but he declined. His impatience started to show when he commented, quote, "This shouldn't take so long, and let's get this show on the road." Once refueling was completed, Cooper laid out his flight plan. The plane would head southeast towards Mexico City at minimum airspeed and altitude possible. The landing gear was to be deployed, wing flaps were to be lowered 15 degrees, and the cabin should be unpressurized. The rear exit door should also be open, and the aft air stair was to be extended. The crew was concerned about how they would even stay in the air with those demands. The one that was a deal breaker was the rear exit door and air stair, for safety reasons. Cooper reluctantly agreed, but then said that he wanted Mucklow to remain on board. 4 crew members in total were aboard for takeoff, and because Cooper had requested an additional parachute, they thought that he planned to take a hostage with him. At 7:40 p.m., the plane took off from Seattle as 3 military jets followed behind. Mucklow asked Cooper to take the bomb with him, to which he said that he would either disarm it or take it with him. About 5 minutes into the flight, Cooper asked Mucklow to release the aft air stair, but she refused. He told her to go to the cockpit and stay there. She did as she was told and peeked at him one last time from the front of the plane as he was tying a bag of money to his waist. She was supposedly the last one to ever see Dan Cooper.
I mean, if I was a passenger on the plane, I'd be freaking the fuck out. I'd be sitting there hyperventilating, using the oxygen mask and ringing the bell.
Excuse me, can I get off, please?
If I can't get off, can I at least get a Diet Coke? If I'm gonna be a hostage, I can at least ask for a second Diet Coke.
At 8 p.m., a cockpit warning light flashed, indicating that the aft air stair was deployed. Captain Scott used the intercom to ask Cooper if he needed help, to which he simply replied, no. At 8:13 p.m., the tail section suddenly pitched upward, right around the suburbs north of Portland. The crew wasn't sure what happened and tried multiple times to communicate with Cooper via the intercom to get him to raise the air stair again, but there was no response. By 11:02, Captain Scott landed at the Reno Tahoe Airport. He searched the cabin and confirmed that Cooper was gone, and the bomb squad came in to declare the plane safe. That is the last of Cooper, supposedly.
The tail goes up and he's gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the air stair goes down, plane pitches upward, and he's gone.
Interesting. Interesting. Why would the tail pop up if the stairs went down?
I'm only guessing that, and seeing some recreations of this, that maybe he weighted it down a little bit as he climbed down on the stairs, and after he jumped, his weight kind of like lifted. You know what I mean? Like the weight's now gone, so it lifts a little bit.
I mean, I guess, but that would be, I guess, a big lift.
I don't know how dramatic the pitch upward was, but I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. The investigation began immediately and was dubbed NORJAC for Northwest Hijacking. Police looked up the name D. Cooper, and they found a petty criminal from the area who went by the name D.B. Cooper. They tracked him down at his home and questioned him, but it quickly became obvious that he wasn't their man. There is no way that he would have made it back to his home that quickly after jumping out of the plane. The incident hit the news very quickly, and there was an error in the reporter's notes that conflated the ruled out suspect, D.B. Cooper, and Dan Cooper. D.B. Cooper was the name that was mentioned in the news, and that's the one that stuck. So that's how he got his name. Like, he wasn't even called D.B. Cooper. It's because of this reporter's error. Like, isn't that crazy?
And the fact that it went viral in 1971 when there really wasn't any way to go viral is kind of wild. Like, this is all just kind of word of mouth.
True. I mean, but this was a huge epic manhunt very early on.
Well, yeah, the guy jumped out of a plane.
Investigators combed the plane for evidence, though there wasn't much. They obtained 66 of Cooper's fingerprints, as well as 2 hair samples, 8 Raleigh cigarette butts, and a black clip-on JCPenney tie that Cooper took off before the jump and left behind. The tie had a gold tie clip with a circular mother-of-pearl setting in the center of the clip, so very specific.
You know, as a society have really just evolved past the need for clip-on ties.
It was funny, though, because he really came off as more of this like suave businessman, and then to find out he had this like cheap clip-on tie, like it didn't quite fit the aesthetic. So do you have any ideas of like what happened?
My first question is the bomb real?
We don't know. The assumption is that it was not, but we don't know.
Was it actual explosives, or are we talking like Chris Farley wearing road flares?
I don't think it was that stupid, because I think he tried to make it look real, but I don't think it was. And like I said, the documentaries I watched kind of hinted that it probably wasn't. At the time, fingerprint tracking was in its infancy, and they had nothing to compare it to. This was also way before DNA testing, but they did hang on to some of the evidence for later testing. In 2001, they were able to build a partial DNA profile from the tie. However, when they went to test the hair and the cigarette butts, the evidence had either been lost or destroyed.
Dun dun dun.
Those could have really answered some questions, but
I would have understood more if the samples had just degraded, because it had been 30 years. But the fact that they were just lost or destroyed makes me think that's just general fuck-uppery.
agreed. Investigators interviewed witnesses from Portland, Seattle, and Reno, and a series of composite sketches were done of Dan Cooper. Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow gave near identical descriptions of Cooper: 5 feet 10 inches tall, 170 to 180 pounds, mid 40s, black comb-backed hair with a receding hairline, olive skin tone, and spoke with a low tone but no discernible accent. The first composite sketch was released to the public on November 28th, 4 days after the hijacking. Both Schaffner and Mucklow said that the sketch looked nothing like Cooper. Another composite sketch was done in late 1972, though witnesses thought that he looked too angry, nasty, and, quote, like a hoodlum. Cooper was more refined in his appearance, they argued. A third composite sketch was done early the following year. The FBI also released the ransom money serial numbers to financial institutions, casinos, racetracks, and other businesses that made large transactions shortly after the hijacking. The serial numbers were released to the public in 1972. Northwest offered 15% of the ransom money, up to $25,000, for anyone who turned in any or all of the money. In 1973, newspapers were offering up to $5,000 for just one ransom bill, though they never found any matches. By 1975, Northwest's insurance company paid out the ransom owed by the order of the Minnesota Supreme Court. What stumped investigators from the very beginning was where Cooper would have landed when he jumped out of the plane. On December 6, 1971, 12 days after the hijacking, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover approved the military to retrace and photograph the flight path for Northwestern Flight Number 305. After 5 attempts, they could not get any good photos of the flight path. They couldn't easily tell where he would have landed for numerous reasons. First, Cooper jumped out of the plane on a moonless, cloudy, rainy night. The military jets didn't see him jump, and he wasn't picked up on the radar. They didn't know exactly when and where he jumped out of the plane after he sent Mucklow to the cockpit, or when he opened his chute, if he did. Investigators narrowed down the drop site area to about an hour from the southernmost point of Mount St. Helens, near Lake Mervyn in Washington state. A massive search of the harsh terrain ensued, with multiple helicopter, boat, and foot searches, as well as door-to-door farmhouse visits, but it yielded nothing. Another search was conducted in the spring of 1972, and the only thing that was found was the body of a teenage girl who had been murdered. So I think that if there's only one good thing to come out of this, it's hopefully that girl's family got some closure.
I mean, that's something. How does no one see a guy jumping out of a plane?
It was nighttime,
Right.
though.
I know, but still wrapped up in parachutes like the Michelin Man.
I think you're thinking this was more obvious than it was.
I guess part of the whole thing about this is that he was able to blend in so well.
Early computer projections from a joint investigation between Northwest, the Air Force, and the FBI showed that the original drop zone was off, and Cooper likely jumped more southeast over the town of La Center, Washington. Searches of the new area also yielded no evidence. Some speculated that the eruption of Mount St. Helens destroyed any evidence that was left from Cooper. The only piece of physical evidence from the hijacking found outside of the plane was found on February 10, 1980. An 8-year-old boy named Brian and his family were vacationing along the Columbia River about 20 miles from the original potential drop site. He found $5,800 of the ransom money. The bills were very disintegrated from exposure, but they were still bundled together in the same order that Cooper was given them.
Run to the bank, kid.
Investigators determined that the damage to the bills was likely from river action and not that it had been buried. In 1986, the bills were divided equally between Brian and Northwest. Brian later sold some of the bills on eBay. Another piece of the puzzle that is highly debated is the parachutes. Cooper asked for 4 parachutes, 2 front and 2 back, but only took 1 set with him. One of those 2 parachutes that he took was unusable, as it was only used for classroom demonstrations. The canopy was sewn shut so students could experience pulling the ripcord without the canopy deploying. Did he try to use that one and it didn't deploy? We don't know.
Well, that would make a lot of sense because then he would go splat.
Yeah, but there's nothing, there's no evidence of him
And
anywhere.
there's no splat. There's not even evidence of a partial splat.
Something else Cooper may or may not have known was that these particular parachutes were ones that could not be steered, making a potential landing more difficult. A lot of people question if he knew enough about operating parachutes to turn down the instructions. Did he know these things? It wasn't clear that he knew about the training parachute or that he knew this particular type of parachute wasn't steerable. I mean, you would still be okay, but you just couldn't, you had no control over it after that.
Yeah, and also too, if you're landing in a forest, odds are you're gonna get caught on a tree. I would assume that they're gonna find pieces of the parachute in the tree somewhere.
You would think so, right? In the beginning, investigators didn't think that Cooper survived. It really wasn't evident at the time that he had any skydiving experience. The temperature and weather that night were harsh as it was cold and rainy. Landing in the rough terrain, as you mentioned, would have made it really difficult to survive. He also lacked proper gear: no helmet, gloves, goggles, or boots. Wearing loafers would likely have resulted in a significant leg or ankle injury if he did land. Cooper also had no other survival equipment if he did land. In addition, the ransom money was never accounted for, and there was no evidence or possibility, according to the FBI, that there was an accomplice on the ground waiting to help him. Early on, the investigators speculated that he probably never even got his chute open. But in the months after the hijacking, there were 5 copycat hijackings, in which all of the men survived. Some had even harsher conditions than Cooper did.
If the weather was that bad, would the parachute, even if it had open, would it had been able to withstand the weather?
That didn't really come up, but I assume yes. If these other men survived in worse conditions, then I'm thinking, yeah, it was fine.
Well, that's it. We're assuming that they're landing in, like, maybe flat open ground, but the combination of the weather and landing potentially in a forest, I'm thinking might have challenged the integrity of the chute.
It may, I mean, we don't know in what
Yeah.
conditions these other landed in. There was a huge spike in hijackings in 1972 with at least 31 that year. At that point, the FBI had to reevaluate their thoughts on whether he survived or not. In the first 5 years after the hijacking, they looked at over 800 suspects, and a good number of which were false confessions. More on potential suspects in a bit.
Most people aren't interested in just one topic.
Don't settle for a podcast about just one subject. That rhymed.
Greetings. We're technically a conversation, a podcast for curious people by curious people.
On our podcast, we do things just a little bit different.
Every week, we share a new topic, and the other hosts have no idea what the topic will be.
Our topics are all over the place, from light and funny to dark and sometimes spooky.
We've covered everything from true crime, historical events and people, the supernatural and the occult,
I like that.
urban legends and folklore.
My favorite.
No matter what we cover, we try to make the episodes interesting and funny.
Don't mean to be the bad guy, but our lawyer said we legally couldn't call our show funny.
We have a lawyer.
Let me tell you what I told our lawyer. Come here so I can show you how far I can legally stick my high-heeled boot up your...
Check us out at technicallyaconversation.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Technically a conversation.
We're like a lifestyle brand.
Yeah.
The FBI worked for years to develop a profile of Dan Cooper. This hijacking was very well planned, and Cooper supposedly had the knowledge to possibly pull it off. There were 3 things that investigators were pretty sure of. Cooper knew about aviation, he knew about the 727's capabilities, and he was familiar with the local area and terrain. Cooper was able to give the flight crew detailed plans on how to fly the plane. One documentary described it as he was literally flying the plane from outside the cockpit. And I thought that was an incredible analogy, and they're 100% right. He was literally steering the plane with his instructions outside of the cockpit.
I mean, just the ultimate backseat driver.
Yes, essentially. Cooper had enough knowledge of aviation to use the correct terminology and to direct the refuel and the flight plan. He also must have had very specific knowledge and experience with the 727 plane. Because of the design of it, parachuting from it was rather easy. It was often used to drop soldiers during the Vietnam War. The 727 also had a unique feature to it, something that a civilian would never need to know. It was only on the 727 that the aft air stair could open mid-flight and not be overridden by the cockpit. Finally, Cooper must have known the area. The comments he made to Mucklow as they were circling and his mention of McCord Air Force Base led investigators to believe that he was at least familiar with the surrounding area, but they were never able to tie him to the area or to McCord Air Force Base. The FBI does believe Cooper was intelligent and methodical. Several things he did demonstrated to them that this was a carefully crafted and well thought out plan. First, he booked a seat in the last row for several reasons. He wanted to observe and respond to any action in front of him, minimize attack from behind him, and appear less conspicuous to the other passengers. Second, he used a bomb as a weapon instead of a gun or a knife to prevent people from rushing him. And third, he asked for multiple shoots to prevent getting sabotaged equipment if he used them for a hostage. Something else investigators found might just explain the origin of Cooper's name. There was a Belgian comic book series about a superhero named, you guessed it, Dan Cooper. Cooper was a test pilot for the Royal Canadian Air Force who parachuted quite frequently in the series. The comic was never translated into English, making investigators wonder if Cooper had spent an extended period of time in Europe.
So, was there ever any suspects who were like ex-military, black ops, or whatever?
I'm going to go through 4 different suspects, and they all had military background. That was like the number one key for
'Cause
them.
all of that sounds like military training. That's what immediately pops out in my head.
The FBI's 8-page suspect profile of Dan/DB Cooper, released in 1973, includes the following: may be from the Seattle area, may be an Air Force veteran or military trained parachutist, not a sports skydiver, above average intelligence, exercises regularly, not a heavy drinker but smokes about 1 pack per day, commits nonviolent crimes and commits them alone, is adaptable to situations, and is likely to be financially desperate. The FBI never came to a consensus whether they think that he survived or not. The best theory of him not surviving is that he was incapacitated by hypothermia during the jump and would have likely been unable to open his chute. He would have ultimately landed in the Columbia River and drowned. Others think he survived and evaded capture for decades. In November of 1976, a Portland grand jury returned an indictment in absentia against John Doe, aka Dan Cooper, for air piracy and violation of the Hobbs Act, a federal law that prohibits robbery or extortion that affects interstate commerce. The court formally enabled prosecution if he is ever captured in the future.
Goddamn air pirates. You said it was like Alcatraz. This is very Alcatraz-y. This happened like November, December, you said, right? So if it happened November, December, even at a low altitude, I'm assuming it'd be pretty cold. And if he's not wearing proper gear,
To give you a fact on that, it was actually with the wind chill estimated to be below 0.
yeah, I could absolutely see him freezing before he hits the ground. I mean, if I want to Neil deGrasse Tyson just completely pop the bubble here on it, that's probably my most likely scenario. But the fact that they never recovered a body, the fact they never recovered any money, although if the wind chill was below 0, that water had to be even colder. I don't know about the way they made suits in the 1970s. Maybe it was lined with asbestos, but I don't think like a Giorgio Armani suit's gonna hold up in in below negative wind chills. I'm interested to see what you think because I tend to agree with the hypothermia.
I have thoughts. I have thoughts on what happened. Now, let's take a look at a few potential suspects in the case that have emerged over the years. Now, there were hundreds and hundreds of suspects, but these I thought were the 4 most interesting ones. So I want to know what, Tom, you think, and then what the listeners think about them. First up, we have Ted Braden. Braden served as a Special Forces commando in Vietnam and was arguably one of the military's best parachutists at the time, making a minimum of 911 jumps. He deserted the military while in Vietnam to serve as a mercenary in Congo, but was tracked down, arrested, and court-martialed soon after. Turns out he was honorably discharged after agreeing to keep military secrets. Braden was not well liked personally and was described by people who knew him as, quote, someone with a secret death wish who puts himself in unnecessary danger and always gets out of it. He's also been described as the perfect combination of intelligence and criminality. At the time of the Northwest hijacking, Braden was 43 years old and working as a truck driver in the drop zone area. He closely matched the build and description of Cooper, and he was already on the FBI's radar in the early 70s for stealing $250,000 in a truck scam, as well as other theft charges. He later went to federal prison and could never be directly connected to the Cooper hijacking. What do you think about him?
Right build, right military background. I will reserve my judgment until I hear the other three, but that one would fit probably checks off a lot of boxes on the profile.
That's fair. I want to see which of these four you think is the most likely to be him. Next, we have a man named Kenneth Peter Christensen. In 2003, a Minnesota man, Lyle Christensen, was watching a TV documentary about the Cooper case and was immediately convinced that Cooper was his brother, Kenneth. Lyle tried to contact the FBI and then a famous movie director to tell his story, but he wasn't taken seriously. Kenneth was a trained Army paratrooper who later worked as a laborer and then a flight attendant for Northwest Orient Airlines, based in Seattle. It is rumored that he was upset about pay cuts by Northwest. Kenneth was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking, smoked quite a bit, and enjoyed his bourbon. He also had a lot of unexplained cash in the months after the hijacking, giving a family member money to buy a house, and he bought his own house in cash as well. He certainly couldn't afford to do that on his salary. Though he was of a similar build to Cooper, he was a bit shorter and thinner. Florence Schaffner said that he was the closest person that fit what Cooper looked like, but she couldn't definitively identify him as Cooper. Christensen passed away in 1994. By 2010, frustrated that no one was listening to his story, Lyle hired a private investigator who published a book detailing the reasons why Kenneth was Dan Cooper. A subsequent documentary came out in 2011, but the FBI maintains that there is no direct evidence that Kenneth was involved and that he is not a suspect. Any thoughts on him?
So first I had to check. REM's song, What's the Frequency, Kenneth, is not about this. It's actually about two guys who beat up Dan Rather while saying, Kenneth, what is the frequency?
I appreciate that fact check.
They couldn't prove any of the bills. He was using any of the bills. And the fact that the brother kept trying to sell the story, that gives me pause. That makes me suspicious. If you think your brother did this, why are you trying to sell the story to Miramax?
I do agree with you that the brother is a bit suspicious.
So far, the first one seems the best fit.
Now, this next one is a little bit out there, but I'm wondering if you know about this guy, and actually I'd love to do an episode on him. So another name mentioned around the D.B. Cooper case is John List. List was a businessman in his 40s who murdered his wife, 3 teenage kids, and his 85-year-old mother in their home in New Jersey in 1971, just 15 days prior to the hijacking. He matched the description of Cooper, and since he was a fugitive, he supposedly, quote, had nothing to lose. He also had a military background. List was on the run, living a new life until his capture in 1989. He denies any involvement in the D.B. Cooper case, and the FBI concluded that he was not a suspect. Do you know John List? Do you know that story?
I do not. I still like the first one.
Lastly, we have Richard McCoy, an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam and was an avid recreational skydiver. On April 7, 1972, McCoy carried out the best-known copycat hijacking of Cooper's. He carried out the hijacking on a United Airlines Boeing 727 flight from Colorado. He used a fake grenade and an unloaded pistol to demand $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. He made a successful jump from the plane. He was arrested 2 days later with the ransom money on him, and he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. He did manage to escape from prison 2 years later, but within months, the police tracked him down and killed him in a shootout. McCoy would never confirm or deny if he was, in fact, Dan Cooper. A former FBI agent is convinced that McCoy was Cooper because of the similarities in the two hijackings. McCoy's family also said that the mother of pearl tie clip belonged to him. However, McCoy didn't quite match the description of Cooper and was only 29 at the time of the first hijacking. And his ears were allegedly too pointy to be Cooper's. The FBI did rule him out because there was evidence that he was in Las Vegas on the day of Cooper's hijacking, and he was in Utah the following day visiting family for Thanksgiving. There is also no direct evidence of McCoy's involvement. And I don't believe that they ever tested the tie for his DNA, but I could be wrong. I didn't come across that, and I'm just assuming that they didn't.
If this clip-on tie was like a JCPenney clip-on tie, I'm assuming this is not like a one of one.
No.
Like these were probably maybe not mass produced, but as close to mass produced as you were going to get. There could have been about 150,000 other people with those mother of pearl clip-on ties.
Well, the tie was one thing. The tie was mass produced. I don't know about the tie clip. That might have been in the family or something special. I don't know.
Okay, that's true. Did they ever say anything about his voice?
No.
See, because I'm picturing the way you described him to me was nondescript, non-accent. So basically, insert your corporate CEO here because they all look and sound the same. Anyone that doesn't have like that corporate executive, like completely nondescript, is gonna be a no for me. I still like the first suspect best, but he's a close second because of the skydiving and the military background.
I agree. I think the only thing that throws me off about him was that they were able to track him down out of state on both the day and the day after. So that kind of gives me pause. But yeah, I think the guy that fits the best is the first one.
Also, too, like he kept getting caught.
And I think something I was thinking about, and again, I feel like I've seen this more on TV. I don't actually know anybody in the FBI, but sometimes I feel like the FBI is too quick to rule out suspects that don't like perfectly fit their profile. You know what I mean? And I feel like there was something about each of these guys that they were like, okay, this piece doesn't fit. Nope, it's not him.
I mean, you watch enough Dateline, you see how this stuff works, and you see kind of the conclusions that are jumped to right away. Would it shock me? Absolutely not.
You're also talking about a very high profile case where I think that there was a lot of pressure on the FBI to make sure they had the right guy and to solve this. And then they just never did.
I was just about to say I'm assuming there's probably a ton of public and media pressure here to make an arrest. I don't necessarily know if he was dangerous. Like, and again, this is back in 1971. There would have been even more pressure to do it now. See, I also go the other way that I think they would have jumped to a conclusion just to say they made an arrest.
I think what helped in this case is that this was a non-violent crime. Nobody really got hurt. And like I said, the sentiment at the time was very like anti-authority and pro-rebel. So I don't think it was so much pressure from the public as you would see like in a murder case or a serial killer case. But I do think it was pressure from Northwest, pressure, from the government, pressure from the media to figure this out. So I just think that's an interesting distinction with this case, that there wasn't like a mob mentality from the general public that like this guy has to be caught. Like it's a really interesting mystery that a lot of people like to speculate on, especially to this day. But the fact that there wasn't, like I said, there was nobody with pitchforks like saying, you got to get this guy. There's a dangerous man out there. It's just like, hey, some dude robbed the man and he was trying to get away with it. Do you know what I mean? So,
I mean, listen, I'm sure there was a ton of pressure from the powers that be. I think you're right. I think that's where the pressure was coming from, not necessarily the public. There was a lot of people with very much a vested interest having this guy caught. Even if it was just to say, we got a guy, this is the guy.
In 1978, the plane used in the Cooper hijacking was sold to Piedmont Airlines and continued domestic service until 1996 when it was scrapped. From 1971 to 2016, the FBI processed more than 1,000 serious suspects and narrowed down the list to just 24. On July 8, 2016, after 45 years, the FBI suspended its active investigation of the Northwest hijacking. All of the evidence in this case is currently available to the public. The D.B. Cooper unsolved mystery lives on in books, movies, and pop culture. And every year since 2018, CooperCon attendees meet over several days in Seattle to discuss the case. So, as we wrap up, I want to know from you, what do you think happened?
I still think it's the hypothermia. I think one of the parachutes either didn't open or got caught on a tree, those big, tall pine trees or whatever they have. And I think he either landed on the ground or landed in the river. What do you think?
I am a little bit torn because I think that it was dangerous and potentially unlikely, but I do think he had military background. He's done this before, jumped out of planes before. What gets me, and every time I've gone through the story and thought about this, it's that nothing was ever found. No parachute remnants, no briefcase bomb. It wasn't on the plane, so he must have taken it with him or threw it out. No money bag, no body. If he fell directly into the Columbia River, something would have washed up over there. Maybe not the body, something would have washed up besides that chunk of money that the kid found. So that really makes me wonder that there was nothing ever found. So kind of like the Alcatraz episode, I know these weren't like stand-up guys, but like I kind of want him to have done it. You kind of root for him to have survived.
I just don't. That's almost like a precision jump. And that takes weeks of planning. You can't be off by like a millimeter. I don't think in that weather, even with supposed training, he could have done it.
But how do you account for the other copycats that all survived?
Well, we don't know where they landed.
True, but like I said, I think they weren't all, soft, flat areas.
No, but we have an idea that he landed in a forest.
They don't quite know, like I said, when and where he jumped. So if they don't have the precise time of that or when he would have opened his chute, that changes everything. That can put him off by miles.
So much would have had to go right for him to make that landing. There are people that would have been far more qualified that have struggled to have us make a similar landing. I don't think he did it, but they would have found something.
I was going to ask you that. So what happened to all the missing items?
Again, you just brought up something. What if they weren't looking in the right place?
Yeah. But you'd think like 50 years and nothing, nobody came across anything. Or maybe somebody did come across something and like didn't think it was significant to the case or knew about the case, so that could be a possibility.
The other thing too is we don't know if the money landed with him. We already know that one of the parachutes didn't work. Maybe when he opened the parachute, out came the money. So if that's the case, now that would explain why the only thing that was found was the one pack, and it might have been spread out over miles.
It is interesting to me that had been separated from the rest of the money and like why. And that seemed to be untouched, like I said, from when they gave it to him. So that is an interesting part of it.
Was it done to throw people off the scent? Did he explicitly throw that one bundle away to try and think that's where he landed?
I mean, that's a great point because if you think about it, he still had $195,000 of the money. This was such a small amount of it. Like, that would have been genius.
Who's going to know?
Yeah, exactly. You would think that when they found this, they would just assume that he's dead. Maybe that's what he wanted them to think.
To be honest, I have no idea where the Columbia River empties out into. If you live out there, please let me know. Like, does this empty out into like the Pacific Ocean? It's a lot harder to find a body in the fucking ocean than it is in the river.
Yeah, that's true. What I also want to know from you is, do you think that the FBI profile was close?
I mean, it's the J. Edgar Hoover FBI. They had a lot of hands and a lot of pies, so to speak. I think they're right on the military experience. I think they're right on the skydiving background. I don't think they're right on the nonviolent crime because even threatening violence is a big leap. And again, we also don't know if it's a real bomb or not. But even just having that is that's a big leap for someone who only would do quote unquote nonviolent crime.
I mean, he didn't use it, and we don't know that it was real.
He didn't use it, but what I'm saying is nonviolent crime tends to be more cerebral. I don't necessarily equate that with using a weapon, even if it's a fake weapon.
But he did need something to deter them, because who would have taken him seriously at that point?
I don't think it's completely accurate, but I think it's as close as we're going to get.
I agree with you on the military background and the parachuting experience. But I think they took a few leaps in assuming certain things about him that I don't think was necessarily true. Like, maybe not necessarily the profile of it, but some of the things they thought through of why he did certain things. I don't necessarily, like, how did you get there? You didn't know what was inside his head. You know what I mean? So I think they made some big assumptions there. In general, it probably wasn't too far off.
Once you told me about why he sat in the back of the plane to basically surveil, that immediately I went to military. That's a military tactic. Make sure basically you have eyes on everyone, that there's no threats from behind. Like, that's almost like a paramilitary tactic.
And just to wrap it up, I really think that DB Cooper or Dan Cooper, it's really in my head now that he's not DB Cooper, that it was Dan. So, like, it's hard for me to call him that now. But he really has become like this folk hero. And like I said, I think because he didn't hurt anybody, because he was trying to screw over the man and get money, I really think he's been elevated in pop culture to be this like person that maybe he necessarily wasn't, but people are just endlessly fascinated and have their own opinions about what happened or didn't happen here. So I know you don't think that he survived, but if he did, would you be glad that he got away with this? Like, do you see why people put him on this pedestal as this like folk hero?
Yeah, I do. But if he survived, though, like, how do you get rid of that money? That's the only reason why I say he didn't survive, is you're basically sitting on hot money that everyone in the country is looking for.
There was a theory that I came across in one of the documentaries that said that perhaps it was less about the money and more about like the risk of it and like, I can do this. You know what I mean? Like, I can pull this off, which I don't necessarily believe. I do think that there is a monetary incentive here for him. But again, like, the motive just eludes me. Like, why? Why Northwest? Was it because he worked there? What was his grudge? I wish he would have elaborated a little bit more on what his grudge was, because he was mad about something enough to do this.
But still kept his head.
Yeah, he didn't become like a screaming lunatic, putting like hostages in headlocks. Do you know what I mean? Like, he wasn't that type of guy. So tell us what you guys think. Do you think he survived? Do you think he did not survive? What was his motive? What do you think happened here? There's a lot of unanswered questions that I think drive a lot of people crazy. Okay, everyone, that is our show. Tune in 2 weeks for another episode from Tom.
As always, rate, subscribe, tell us what you think. We love to hear from you. reach us at Gmail, tellmeaboutpodcast@gmail.com, on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at the Tell Me About Podcast.
See you in 2 weeks, everybody.
Bye.